Remember the dirt track that ran through the woods, past old Mike's farm and then rolled on down to the river? Sure you do. In those summer afternoons, the skies were always black and trembling. It was as dark as night, until a flash of lightning skipped from one cloud to another, and the whole world lit up, looking pale and terrified. Amazing thing, a dirt track. At a glance, it's just mud and stones and puddles. But when you get there and you walk along it yourself, you realize there's a bit more going on than that. Peter, the scruffy little boy from Old Grange, was the first person to ever walk down that track. That's how he saw it anyway. His old plimsolls were leaving footprints in an undiscovered land. Like Buzz Lightyear and Louis Armstrong, walking on the moon. Buzz Aldrin, you mean? And it's Neil Armstrong. Louis the fellow with the trumpet. Whatever, Ma. I'm an explorer now. Are you so? I am, yeah. And what did you find down there, Peter? A couple of older boys were making fires. They didn't see me. The older boys were Dan and Kyle. A couple of academic types, in their late teens who'd been reading more than what's good for their heads. So what'll it be like, said Kyle, after the revolution? Dan poked at the crusty grey logs with his long stick of oak. Be better than this, I tell you that. The fire crackled, and a couple of orange sparks jumped up into the air. For Dan, this moment was everything. It was the future. He stood up, he looked to the foggy horizon, and saw 2 soldiers of the Red Division approaching. They were tired and shaggy looking. What's the news from the south? Said Dan. The first man gave him a harsh stare. He sat down by the fire and took a big drink of water. Dan turned to the second. Well? Well, the soldier said. There's a lot of movement in the city's underground, Captain. Whispers of a counter-revolutionary coup. It's the Old Masons. Rumours of them reforming with help from the establishmentarians. They're whipping up the locals into a frenzy. Their numbers are growing exponentially. They've got people, they've got wealth, they've got power. Dan kicked at the ground and sent shards of dry black mud skidding into the field. Did you see any of this yourself? He said. The man didn't answer. He looked to his fellow soldier who was staring at the dancing yellow flames. The soldier rolled himself a cigarette and looked up at Dan with these cold, hard eyes. It's everywhere, he said. You can smell it in the air. It's over, Captain. We need to get out of here. They'll be coming for us. They'll be coming for you especially. And that's it, is it? Dan said. He put his hands behind his back and began to march slowly, left to right, right to left. First sign of a struggle and yous are wanting to throw in the towel. Head to the hills. Abandon the good people of this godforsaken land. Come on now. Aren't our hearts still beating? This is not the time for weakness. It is a time for strength. This is not the time to run. This is the time to fight. This is not the time for doubt, but the time for hope, and courage, and strength. The 2 soldiers were listening intently. Captain Dan's words were giving them tingles on the backs of their necks and all of their arms. Captain Dan stopped marching. He looked at the 2 soldiers. The one sat by the fire, tossed his cigarette away, and stood up straight. I want yous to head down to the river, Dan said. Take the boat into town. Find Lieutenant Doyle. He'll be somewhere in the ruins of the chapel. Tell him to gather his troops and bring them back here. Get the dirt bikes ready. And fill the old bus with all the ammunition we have. Tomorrow we'll ride to the south. Tomorrow we'll confront the old masons of the city. Tomorrow we will claim what's ours. I thought you was the first person down there, Peter's mother said. Yeah, I am, Ma. First one ever. Then what about the older boys you saw then? Peter shrugged. He kicked at the skirting board for no particular reason. They was ghosts, Ma. The ghosts all come out of the trees down there. Is that so? Yeah, it is so. That's why they call it the dead trees. The dead trees? Detective Gray nodded her head. That's what they call it, she said. Oh, that's just brilliant, Detective. I thought we were going to try and tackle something less ominous after the whole Skull Pyramids of Mexico thing last month. Detective Gray's assistant, Mr. Blake, was a nervous, timid man at the best of times. Detective Gray could hear the trepidation in his voice as they walked up the track and approached the dark, shadowy woods. Dare I ask why they call it the dead trees? I don't know, Detective Gray said. Mr. Blake stopped walking. His arms dangled down from his shoulders in a sort of lifeless disbelief. He'd never heard Detective Gray admit that there was something she did not know. After all, it was Mr. Blake that first gave her the nickname Miss Omniscience, that the tabloid papers now so frequently used to refer to the famous lady. Miss Omniscience noticed that her cautious companion was no longer walking half a step behind her. She paused and turned around. "What is it?" she said. Mr. Blake took a deep, apprehensive breath. "You don't know," he said. "That only magnifies the sense of dread being delivered to me by this escapade." "What are you talking about, Mr. Blake?" "Well, it seems like a bad omen to me. If even you don't know why they call it the Dead Trees." Detective Gray looked at Mr. Blake quizzically. She took a moment to study his eyes. The look in his eyes allowed her to travel into his mind, and even if the man was being illogical and foolish, it only took a second for her to understand. Her extraordinary ability to empathize with others was described as a superpower in one of the newspapers. "I see," she said. She turned back to the woods and continued walking towards them. As she predicted, Mr. Blake followed, and once again he was a half step behind her. "Not for the first time, Mr. Blake. You've overlooked something's true context. Remember the monkey of South Sudan? The one with the revolver?" "How could I forget?" said Mr. Blake as he looked down at his feet. "You became so fixated on trying to figure out who could train the monkey to use a gun that you forgot entirely about the victim. And it's the victim that matters the most," Mr. Blake said, remembering Miss Omniscience's words at the time. "If you had inquired further, then you would have found that the victim was not, as you so delicately put it, some random lady of the night, and she was actually, shall we say, a close companion of the Egyptian prince. A little further investigation and you would have learned that the prince was going through a bit of a rebellious streak and trying to defy his father, the king, who was setting the prince up with a wealthy diplomat's daughter, who the prince despised as much as a slug despises a salt pot. And if you had then realized that the king had heard about his son's meetings with the victim and had been horrified to find out that the prince actually intended to marry this lady of the night, then you may have discovered, quite quickly, a clear motive and indeed a prime suspect. And then, if you weren't so busy interrogating every zookeeper, safari owner and ringmaster in North Africa, you might even have realized that there was no monkey of South Sudan in the first place. The witness who stated the monkey pulled a trigger was in fact a hitman, hired to do the job himself, and all that monkey business was just a distraction used to discombobulate any amateur detectives. Mr. Blake nodded his head. He looked up and saw that they were getting close to the woods. "You see," said Detective Gray, "you overlooked the true context. There was a murder weapon, and there was a victim. That in and of itself tells you a story. But I digress. Mr. Blake, my point is, simply, that you have overlooked the true context again today." The two of them stopped walking. The gnarled black trees loomed over them. A silvery white fog slithered between the trunks and the branches. Detective Gray looked at Mr. Blake. Mr. Blake had completely forgotten why they were having a conversation about the monkey of South Sudan in the first place. Miss Omniscience looked into his eyes again and instantly knew that she needed to remind him. "I didn't say that I didn't know why they called it the Dead Trees, because that was not the question. You asked me if you dared to ask why they are called the Dead Trees. I said I didn't know, because frankly, Mr. Blake, I don't. Only you can answer that." Mr. Blake nodded again slowly. "Well," Detective Gray said, "do you want me to tell you? Do you dare to find out?" Mr. Blake looked back into the woods. He took another long, apprehensive breath. "What are you doing, Ma?" said Peter. Peter's mother awoke from her reverie. "Oh, just daydreaming," she said. She looked down at the chopping board, placed another carrot on it, and continued to chop. "What are you dreaming for?" asked Peter. "Well, it's what we do. We fall into daydreams sometimes. Little fantasies. It can't be helped." "I don't daydream," Peter said. "Oh, is that so? What about those ghosts you saw? They weren't really ghosts, were they?" "They were ghosts, Ma. I saw another one in the barn. Scary looking woman she was. In her wedding dress and everything. Reckon she died when she got married or something." "Ah, Peter, you're just being daft now." "I'm not, Ma. Swear." The ghost that little Peter had seen was actually old Mike's wife, Julie. While she wasn't really a ghost, it's true that she was wearing her wedding dress. Old Mike had passed away just a couple of days ago, and Julie was utterly heartbroken. I feel like something has been taken from me, she wrote in a letter to her sister. Like a limb has been cut off, but worse, far worse. I could live without an arm or a leg, but without him, I just don't know. I keep thinking back to our wedding day. It was so special. He got the barn all done up nice. Of course, I was against the idea right up until the last moment. He kept saying we couldn't afford this, and it would be too expensive if we did that. I was mortified, to tell you the truth. Me, married in a barn? Could you imagine it? But then that morning, when I saw what he'd done to the place, all the effort he'd put in, the little fairy lights and the candles, his Uncle Joey with the piano set up in the corner, and the flowers, oh, the flowers, the Easter lilies and the red clovers and the spring squills that him and his brother had gathered from the meadows. It was the best thing I could ever imagine. I remember Ma's face, so proud she was. Remember how she cried and cried and cried. And now I look at that barn and see it all damp and empty and broken. And I think to myself, that's life really, isn't it? Things just can't be what they once were. Julie put down her pen. She would look at the letter again tomorrow. Probably she would never send it. She sat in the quiet house for a while. She could hear the high-pitched whistles of the Dunnocks outside. She stood up, walked to the window, and saw in the distance 2 teenage boys by the dirt track. They were sat by a fire. The fire was sending a silvery white smoke slithering into the woods. Things just can't be what they once were. The line from Julie's letter haunted her. She wondered maybe if there was a way to bring some of it back. So what'll it be like, said Kyle, after the revolution? Dan poked at the crusty grey logs with his long stick of oak. The fire crackled and a swarm of orange sparks flew towards Kyle's face. Kyle had to swat them away to stop them from burning his eyes. Be better than this, I tell you that. Lieutenant Doyle was sitting amongst the debris of what used to be the chapel. One of the columns had been destroyed during the bombing last year. Now there was just a small circle of stone, sticking out of the ground like a tree stump. Lieutenant Doyle used it as a stool, and one of the walls that had fallen down lined itself up nicely for him to use as a desk. The dirt track, wrote the lieutenant on an old crisp sheet of paper. Remember the dirt track that ran through the woods, past old Mike's farm, and then rolled on down to the river? Sure you do. The 2 soldiers that Dan had sent approached the ruins cautiously. The whole town had an eerie feel to it. The old chapel on the hill was the creepiest, most sinister-looking building of them all. I've heard he's mad, said the first soldier quietly. Shh, said the second. He smacked his companion on the arm. Ouch, said the first soldier. He rubbed the spot where he'd been struck. I'm just saying. Well, don't. Be quiet. He could be anywhere. The 2 men walked through the rubble. The sun had almost set, and sharp, jagged shadows stretched from one side of the ruins to the other. The first soldier saw some rosary beads on the ground. The cross looked like it was made from real gold. He looked around quickly, ducked down, grabbed the necklace, and dropped it into his pocket. Lieutenant Doyle was watching the 2 men from the dark. 2 thieves, he said. The soldier panicked, took the rosary beads from his pocket, and dropped them onto the floor. Ah, said the second soldier. Lieutenant Doyle, Captain Dan has sent us your way. Lieutenant Doyle looked back at the page in front of him. Amazing thing, he wrote. The dirt track. Lieutenant Doyle, the soldier said. It's Captain Dan. He wants 2 thieves, Lieutenant Doyle said again, interrupting the man. 1 on either side of him. The 2 soldiers looked at each other. I told you, whispered the first, and the second struck him on the arm again. Either side of who? Lieutenant Doyle put down his pen. Jesus, of course. Crucified betwixt 2 thieves. As they hammered the nails into his hands, he cried out to the Lord, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. The first soldier looked at the second with raised brows and big, stretched open eyes. The second soldier gave him another whack on the arm. Oh, he said. Is that so? Well, that's interesting, I suppose, but... Interesting, Lieutenant Doyle said. He stood up and walked towards the 2 men. He crouched down, picked up the rosary beads and placed them back in the first soldier's pocket. He gave him a pat on the shoulder and a friendly smile. I think it's a damn outrage, to tell you the truth. And the truth here is the matter. 2 thieves and a liar. What do you say? Seems to me the men with the hammers and the nails knew precisely what they were doing. Wouldn't you say so? The 2 soldiers were quiet. If that is the truth, then what? Should we assume that Jesus knew this and was trying to protect these people from the Lord? After all, he would know the wrath of God better than any of us. But perhaps Christ's affinity with man is what actually got him crucified in the first place. Christ may well have forgiven the men before the event took place, but maybe God had foreseen this and forgiven them as well. Was it really the duty of Jesus to try and persuade the Heavenly Father to forgive the men? Or should he instead have been asking forgiveness for himself, for even thinking of instructing the Lord on what he should and shouldn't do? This time Lieutenant Doyle let the question float in the air like a feather. "I'm not much of a believer," said the second soldier, "but even so, I'm not sure it's really our place to question the Son of God." And then, Lieutenant Doyle said, "He cries to the Lord, 'Why have you forsaken me?' Well, it's self-evident. It's because you chose to announce it in such a way. Then would have been the time to mention those who had committed the atrocity. Do you see? Christ was closer to us than we think. He too was imperfect. He got it the wrong way round, that's all. He should have said, 'Father, forgive me, for I do not know what I am doing.' And then later, when all the rage was building up inside him, he should have said, 'Why have you forsaken them?' Meaning those who had carried out the ungodly act." There was an unnerving pause for the soldiers. They were hasty to change the subject, but hesitant to say anything in case it triggered another chapter in the lieutenant's monologue. The second soldier finally opened his mouth and was about to say why they were there and explain that it was actually quite an urgent matter when the lieutenant erupted with wild, cackling laughter. The first soldier gave the second another concerned look. This time he wasn't struck on the arm, and instead his companion reflected the look back at him. "But you know," Lieutenant Doyle said. He paused to wipe his leaking eyes with the backs of his fingers. "You know, it's okay. I, for one, forgive him. I mean, it can't be easy to maintain consistent and coherent thought whilst being crucified." The lieutenant began to laugh again. His face flashed black and white as bolts of silver lightning shot rapidly across the sky. His laughter was drowned out by the heavy grumbles of thunder that followed. Julie watched the drops of rain slide down the bedroom window like fat, transparent tadpoles. She took her wedding dress from the wardrobe. She unzipped it from its plastic sheath and placed it neatly on the bed. She sat down at the dresser and began to powder her face. As she did so, she hummed the song that her deceased husband's Uncle Joey had written and played for them on their wedding day.
There is always trouble far ahead and far behind. I don't expect you to fix it, but just to be here by my side. For we will hold each other till the day we die. There won't be a single moment when there's a you and not an I.
Julie put on the dress. It still fit. She turned this way and that in the mirror. She managed to smile. She slipped her wrinkled feet into the crusty silver shoes and did up the buckles. She went downstairs and sauntered slowly to the barn. She remembered it. She could smell the burning candles and the roasting hog. She could hear Uncle Joey's piano jingling away in the corner. She could hear the clapping of hands, the chinking of glasses, the laughter and the tears. She closed her eyes and she saw old Mike. He was there with her, the big bushy beard and the bright blue eyes. He took Julie's hand and took her waist. And once again they were dancing. Old Mike whispered in her ear, "There won't be a single moment when there's a you and not an I." The sky grumbled again. "Would you look at all that rain?" Peter's mother said. "I'd do right to send you out there and have it wash you down so. All that exploring's got you caked in filth." "I'm not going out there," Peter said. "Is that so? Then I guess you better be off to the shower. Your dad will be home soon and the stew's already cooking. Come on now. Don't have it too hot and don't take it too long. But make sure you get that muck off your face before it's time for tea." "All right," Peter said. The boy paused for a moment. He wondered whether to tell his mother about what had happened when the dirt track led him down to the river. He bit his lip. He kicked again at the skirting board for no particular reason. He turned, ran up the stairs and headed for the bathroom. His mother scraped the last chunks of carrot from the chopping board into the boiling pot on the stove. She put on the radio and turned it up to drown out the sound of bubbling water. "The dead trees," Detective Gray said, as she took her first steps into the woods. Go on then," said Mr. Blake, following, half a step behind. "You might as well tell me why they call it that. Whether I dare to hear about it or not, I can sense that you're keen." The corner of Detective Gray's mouth smiled. Mr. Blake also had his moments of sharp observation. "There was a revolution," she said, "many years ago." She stepped over an old knotty branch. and looked around as her eyes readjusted to the darkness. A revolution, you say? Yes, Detective Gray said. A violent and bloody one at that. A troop of revolutionaries were based in Oldgrange, a small town a little further down the river, where we saw the ruins of the old chapel. Ah, yes, I remember, Mr. Blake said. As they walked, he nervously studied all the strange dark shapes that surrounded him. The place gave me the creeps. Well, for once your superstitions have served you rightly. There were these two soldiers based out there. Two thieves, Lieutenant Doyle said yet again, once he had stopped laughing. He looked plainly at the two men before him. Look, said the second soldier, I don't mean to speak out of turn here, Lieutenant, but we really must be moving. Captain Dan needs us back, the other side of the woods. We need to gather all the men that we can. We don't have time for this nonsense. Nonsense? Said the lieutenant. Aye, nonsense, said the first soldier. You just sit around and talk nonsense. We're supposed to be fighting. We're supposed to be bringing down the regime, not sitting around talking. Alright, Kyle said. I'm sorry, I thought we were just chatting, that's all. Captain Dan stared angrily at his friend. You're ruining everything, he said. He hit at the grey logs with his long stick of oak. Every chance we have to make this a better world. You're ruining it. I was just sitting by the fire, said Kyle. What would you have me do? You were supposed to gather the men. What men? We were supposed to fight. Fight who? The dirt track led Peter to the river. The previous night's rain was still running quickly downstream. The boy stopped and looked down and watched the muddy water slosh and flow and slosh and flow. The two soldiers left the old chapel and went all around Old Grange to gather the troops by themselves. Lieutenant Doyle sat back at his makeshift desk and continued to write. But where are they, these men? There's not a soul to be seen. Are they gone? Are they ghosts? Were they ever even here? Little Peter was startled by the raised voices behind him. Dan, Jesus, man, will you stop it? Peter jumped quickly behind a fallen tree and crouched right down. He saw the two older boys emerge from the woods. One was marching forward, the other was on his heels, moving away, pleading with the first. Will you stop it already, please? Dan struck Kyle with a closed fist. Kyle staggered, lost his balance, fell. Jesus, Dan, he said. He wiped at his weeping eyes with the backs of his fingers. Jesus, Dan, please, stop it now. Peter watched. His body felt cold as he saw the one boy kick the other. It made a terrible sound, a kind of dull, thudding sound, like when his mother beat the rugs in the garden. Dan, said Kyle, in a little faraway voice. Dan. Peter closed his eyes and crouched back down. Again and again came the thud. Peter put his arms around his knees and rocked back and forth. When the noise finally stopped, he peered back over the tree. The teenager who had been doing the kicking was now dragging the other boy towards the river. His body looked still and heavy. The face looked broken and puffy and red. Peter watched as the lifeless Kyle was lined up on the edge of the riverbank. And then, with a shove, he was gone. They didn't see me, Peter said to himself. The hot water burned his skin as he scrubbed his face up and down. They didn't see me. Lieutenant Doyle put down his pen. He put his elbows on the desk and his head in his hands. How many died? Said Mr. Blake. It's impossible to know, said Detective Gray. But those who did pass, they say that their souls have haunted these woods ever since. They say that their spirits drift through the trees like a silvery white fog. Mr. Blake shivered. Detective Gray turned to him. She put a hand on his shoulder and shook him ever so lightly. Of course, it could be that it is only myth, Mr. Blake. There's not much in the way of evidence that proves this revolution ever happened in the first place. There are just a few tatty documents here and there. But as the poem goes, the end of one uncanny but now infamous letter, what begins as one may end as two, or three, or four. What begins as one may end as 5, or 6, or more. But whatever its ending, we should not discount all that has come before.